The moment I turned that valve, my own water became everyone else's emergency. The steel handle resisted for just a second before giving way beneath my palm with a low metallic groan. And then the old irrigation pump settled into silence for the first time in nearly 20 years. The steady hum that had filled every sunrise on my family's ranch simply disappeared, replaced by the whisper of a warm Texas breeze sliding through the live oaks. I stood there for another few seconds, smelling damp soil, weathered cedar fencing, and engine oil clinging to the pump house, watching the last trickle of water disappear into a limestone drainage ditch that had crossed this property since long before any subdivision existed. I wasn't angry. I wasn't making a statement. I was shutting off my own water on my own ranch because the main pressure line needed routine maintenance, something my grandfather had taught me to do every spring. Nobody asked permission to service their own property. At least that's what I believed until I heard the first distant siren less than 15 minutes later. At first I assumed there had been a traffic accident on the county highway beyond the eastern pasture. Then another siren joined the first. Then another. The sound echoed across the valley, bouncing off the hills before 3 sheriff's cruisers appeared in a cloud of pale dust, racing straight toward my front gate like they were responding to a dangerous emergency. I remember tasting cold coffee that had gone bitter sitting in my travel mug while I watched them pull into my driveway. One deputy stepped out calmly, another rested a hand near his radio, and the third looked toward the pump house where I was still holding a pipe wrench. Before I could even say good morning, I heard high heels crunch across the gravel behind them. Linda Brooks, white blouse, designer sunglasses, perfect hair that somehow never moved in the wind. President of the Red Creek Estates HOA. She pointed directly at me as if she'd been rehearsing the moment for weeks. "That's him," she shouted loudly enough for half the county to hear. "He's cutting off our community water supply. Arrest him before he destroys more evidence." Evidence. I actually looked around to see if she could possibly be talking about someone else. Then I realized she meant the valve sitting 6 feet away from me. The valve bolted to a pipeline that existed entirely inside my surveyed property line. The valve my grandfather installed back in 1984 with his own hands. The valve connected to a private well that my family paid to drill, maintain, inspect, and repair for decades before Red Creek Estates was anything more than cattle pasture and mesquite brush. The deputies exchanged uncertain looks, and I could already tell something wasn't adding up. One of them asked me if I'd intentionally shut off the water. I answered honestly, "Yes, sir. It's my well." Linda practically laughed. "No," she snapped. "That water belongs to the neighborhood now." Those words hung in the air longer than the sirens had. They carried the confidence of someone who'd repeated a lie so many times she'd started believing it herself. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked past the deputies toward the rolling pasture where generations of my family had built fences, repaired windmills, and protected every inch of this ranch with honest work instead of HOA meetings. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 38 years old, and everything that happened after that morning started because I decided to perform routine maintenance on property that legally belonged to me. What Linda Brooks didn't know was that water has a funny way of following the oldest path available, and so does the law. Ethan Walker, 38 years old, third-generation rancher. If you asked anyone within 50 miles who owned the old Walker Ranch, they would probably point toward the limestone ridge where my grandfather built a weathered red barn with lumber he milled himself after coming home from the Korean War. My family had never been rich, but we had always been land-rich, the kind of wealth measured in fence posts, working wells, and sunrise instead of stock prices. Every morning growing up started with the same soundtrack. Wind creaking through oak branches, meadowlarks singing somewhere beyond the cattle pasture, the steady mechanical hum of the deep well pump that pulled crystal-clear groundwater from more than 400 feet below the surface. My grandfather used to pat the old pressure tank with a smile and tell me, "Son, cattle can survive a dry season, but a ranch survives because somebody remembers to maintain the things nobody else notices." I never forgot those words. After graduating from Texas A&M with a degree in agricultural engineering, I had opportunities to work for construction firms in Dallas and Houston, but every highway leading away from this place somehow felt wrong. I came back because this ranch was more than an address. It was every lesson my father taught me while repairing broken fences beneath the July sun. It was every Thanksgiving spent around a long wooden table built from pecan trees harvested right here on the property. Even the pump house carried memories. The faded green paint had peeled for years, and the old steel door always squealed the same way every single time I opened it. Most people would have seen an aging utility building. I saw the heartbeat of our entire operation. What very few people knew was that the well supplied only my ranch. Every gallon came from groundwater accessed through permits and water rights that had remained attached to this property for decades. The neighboring subdivisions had their own municipal infrastructure when they were first approved. At least that was how everything had been designed on paper. Somewhere along the way, somebody decided paperwork was less important than convenience. I did not realize that decision had quietly transformed my family's well into something certain people believed they were entitled to use forever. When Red Creek Estates appeared about 6 years earlier, I actually welcomed the new neighbors. I waved at construction crews. I let utility trucks cross a temporary service road during heavy rain because the county bridge had flooded. I even allowed surveyors onto my pasture after they asked politely. My father always believed that being a good neighbor cost nothing. Looking back now, I think kindness sometimes looks exactly like permission to people who have never been told no. Standing beside the deputies that morning, smelling fresh cut grass drifting across the pasture while the sun climbed higher over the hills, I realized Linda Brooks had spent years confusing courtesy with ownership. She believed access had become authority. She believed repeated use had somehow erased property lines that had existed since long before her neighborhood brochure was ever printed. I could already see the questions forming behind the deputy's eyes, and I knew this story was about to reach far beyond one quiet ranch, one maintenance job, or one closed water valve. If there was one thing Linda Brooks loved more than neighborhood meetings, it was reminding everyone that she was the president of Red Creek Estates. She carried that title the way some people carried a sheriff's badge, wearing confidence that sounded official even when it was completely unsupported. She drove a pearl-white Lexus sport utility vehicle that somehow always looked freshly detailed, and every Saturday morning she cruised through the subdivision with the windows down, smiling at perfectly trimmed lawns while making mental notes about garbage cans, mailbox colors, and flower beds. She spoke softly, almost sweetly, but every sentence carried the unmistakable weight of someone who expected obedience instead of conversation. The first time we met, she arrived at my ranch carrying a welcome basket filled with cookies, neighborhood newsletters, and a thick binder labeled Community Standards. I thanked her politely, accepted the cookies, and handed the binder right back. I explained that my ranch had been there decades before the subdivision and that my property was never included in the homeowners association. She smiled without blinking and told me that cooperation was always better than isolation. At the time, I thought she was simply trying to be friendly. Looking back, I realized she had been testing boundaries from the very beginning. Over the next few years, she appeared more often than any neighbor reasonably should. Sometimes she arrived with questions about repairing a fence that bordered the subdivision. Other times she wanted permission for landscapers to trim branches hanging near the property line. Then came requests to let contractors temporarily cross one corner of my pasture because it would save them time. Every request sounded reasonable by itself, and because my father had always taught me that good neighbors solved small problems before they became large ones, I usually agreed. Every handshake, every favor, every unlocked gate quietly convinced Linda that my cooperation was permanent instead of voluntary. Then her language slowly changed. She stopped saying thank you and started saying expected. She stopped asking whether workers could enter the ranch and started informing me that crews would arrive Tuesday morning. She began referring to my access road as a shared entrance and described the creek running through my property as a neighborhood resource during one homeowners association newsletter that somehow found its way into my mailbox. I remember laughing when I first read that phrase. It was the kind of confidence that only existed on paper because reality had never challenged it. The strangest part was how many residents believed her. Most families had purchased beautiful homes with polished brochures showing ponds, green spaces, and peaceful views of the surrounding countryside. Very few had ever seen the county surveys or property records. They assumed everything visible from their walking trails belonged to the community because that was what they had been told. Linda understood something powerful. If enough people repeated the same story, eventually it started sounding like history instead of opinion. Standing there beside the silent pump house while deputies listened carefully to both of us, I finally understood why she sounded so certain. She had spent years building authority one small assumption at a time. In her mind, my ranch was no longer private property protected by decades of recorded ownership. It had become another piece of the neighborhood that simply had not accepted her rules yet. She believed she was protecting the community. I knew she was about to discover the difference between managing a subdivision and claiming rights that had never belonged to her in the first place. The deputies asked both of us to slow down, and for a moment the only sound was the wind rattling the dry grass along the fence line. Linda folded her arms with the confidence of someone who believed the conversation had already been decided. I stayed where I was beside the pump house, the familiar scent of warm steel and damp concrete reminding me why I had started this job before sunrise in the first place. One deputy asked the simplest question imaginable. "Has there been a disagreement before today?" I almost laughed because today's argument had not appeared out of nowhere. It had been building one small step at a time for nearly a year. The first warning came the previous summer when I noticed fresh tire tracks crossing a section of my western pasture after a heavy rain. Construction trucks had bypassed the public road and cut across my ranch to reach the backside of Red Creek Estates. I called Linda, assuming one of her contractors had simply made an honest mistake. She apologized immediately and promised it would never happen again. A week later, another crew appeared. This time they parked beside my equipment shed while unloading pipe sections without asking. Again I called. Again she smiled, apologized, and assured me it was only temporary. Then temporary quietly became routine. By autumn I started finding orange utility flags scattered near the creek and fresh digging marks that had never been there before. The soil still smelled raw where machinery had disturbed it, and narrow trenches stretched through an area where only my irrigation lines were supposed to exist. When I asked one contractor what they were installing, he looked genuinely confused. He told me he thought the homeowners association already had approval because they had provided detailed maps showing an existing water connection. That sentence stayed with me long after he drove away. Existing water connection. I walked the property myself that afternoon, boots crunching across limestone gravel, until I reached the far edge of the ranch where mature cottonwood trees shaded the creek. Hidden beneath fresh dirt and new grass, I found a recently installed junction box tied into a pipeline I had never authorized. It was clean work, professionally installed, and carefully concealed unless someone knew exactly where to look. I took photographs from every angle, recorded the location with my phone, and covered the box again exactly as I had found it. I did not remove anything. I did not damage anything. Instead, I sent Linda a courteous email attaching the photographs and politely asking for an explanation. Her reply arrived less than an hour later. She claimed the connection had always existed and insisted it served a shared infrastructure agreement that everyone had benefited from for years. The strange part was that she never attached a single document supporting that claim. Over the following months, I sent 3 more emails, 2 certified letters, and copies of my property survey highlighting every recorded easement on the ranch. I even included contact information for the county records office so nobody could accuse me of hiding facts. Every response from Linda sounded nearly identical. She thanked me for my concern, assured me their attorneys had already reviewed everything, and encouraged me not to interfere with essential community services. Those words echoed through my mind as I stood beside the silent well while deputies listened carefully. I had warned her repeatedly. I had documented every conversation. I had given every opportunity for someone to correct what looked increasingly like a very expensive misunderstanding. Instead of reading the documents I sent, she had mistaken patience for surrender, and that assumption had brought every one of us to my front gate that morning. One of the deputies took a slow walk around the pump house while another spoke quietly into his shoulder radio, confirming addresses and parcel numbers. Nobody was rushing anymore except Linda. She kept insisting that families inside Red Creek Estates had no running water and that I was creating a public emergency. I could hear the urgency in her voice, But I also noticed something else. She never once called the well mine. Every sentence started with our water, our system, our neighborhood. Ownership had quietly disappeared from her vocabulary because she genuinely believed it no longer mattered. I reached into the cab of my old pickup truck and pulled out a thick weathered folder that never left the glove compartment. Inside were copies of surveys, maintenance receipts, inspection reports, and every certified letter I had mailed during the past year. The paper smelled faintly of dust and old printer ink after riding through countless Texas summers. I handed the folder to the senior deputy without saying another word. He flipped through the first few pages while Linda continued explaining how the homeowners association had relied on this water supply for years. The deputy looked up and calmly asked her a question I had been waiting months for someone to ask. "Can you show me the agreement that authorizes that connection?" For the first time that morning, she hesitated. It lasted only a second before she answered that their attorneys handled those records, and that the documents were probably at the homeowners association office. Probably. That single word carried far less confidence than everything she had said during the previous 15 minutes. The deputy nodded politely but kept reading. I watched his eyes pause on the dates attached to my inspection reports. Every maintenance visit had been documented. Every repair invoice listed the same well identification number. Every county permit identified the Walker Ranch as the sole owner of the pumping equipment. Nothing in the folder mentioned Red Creek Estates because nothing legally connected the subdivision to my well. A light breeze carried the smell of freshly cut hay across the pasture while silence settled over the gravel driveway. Even Linda stopped talking for a moment. Then one of the younger deputies received a phone call and stepped a few yards away. He returned less than a minute later with an expression that had completely changed. He quietly told the senior deputy that the county mapping office had confirmed my parcel information exactly as shown on the survey. The pump house, the well, and the valve all sat entirely within my recorded property boundaries. Nobody accused Linda of doing anything wrong. Nobody accused me either. Instead, the conversation shifted from criminal accusations to property records, utility connections, and legal documentation. I could almost feel the direction of the morning changing. Linda noticed it too. She immediately insisted that even if the well belonged to me, shutting it off endangered the community because everyone depended on it now. The senior deputy looked at her for a long moment before asking another simple question. "If your neighborhood depends on this well, why is there no recorded agreement in the county file?" The question hung in the warm morning air without an answer. I had spent months trying to ask that exact question through emails and certified letters. Standing there beside the silent pump, I realized those unanswered letters were about to become far more important than anyone in the homeowners association had ever imagined. The senior deputy closed my folder carefully instead of snapping it shut, almost as if he had realized he was holding something far more important than a stack of old papers. He looked toward the younger deputy and quietly asked him to contact the County Water Resources Office before anyone made another assumption. Linda immediately protested, insisting there was no reason to involve additional agencies because the homeowners association had already verified everything years ago. That sentence caught my attention. Verified with whom? She still could not answer that question. 20 minutes later, the gravel outside my ranch filled with another county vehicle, this one carrying a middle-aged water resources inspector named Daniel Harper. He stepped out wearing dusty work boots instead of polished dress shoes, carrying a weathered clipboard that looked as though it had survived 1,000 field inspections. Before speaking to either of us, he walked directly to the wellhead, brushed away a layer of fine limestone dust, and read the identification plate bolted to the casing. Then he smiled the kind of smile professionals make when equipment tells a story before people do. He asked me one question. "Do you still have the original registration documents for well number 7? I nodded and reached back into the same folder. My grandfather believed important papers should never be more than an arm's length away, so every permit issued since the 1980s had been carefully preserved inside plastic sleeves. Daniel compared the registration number on the paperwork with the metal plate on the well. Every digit matched perfectly. He checked the annual inspection reports. They matched too. Then he opened a county map printed on oversized paper across the hood of my pickup truck. The breeze kept trying to lift one corner while he traced blue utility lines with his finger. I noticed his expression change when he reached the edge of my property. The recorded municipal water main serving Red Creek Estates stopped nearly 600 feet short of my fence line. There was no authorized extension beyond that point. No recorded easement. No utility agreement. No maintenance contract. Nothing. Daniel looked toward Linda with genuine confusion instead of accusation. "Can you show me where the approved connection is documented?" Again there was silence. She searched through her phone, scrolled through emails, opened photographs, and finally admitted that their engineering consultant had handled the installation several years earlier. Daniel nodded politely and asked for the permit number. Another long silence followed. Even the deputies looked at one another without speaking. The only sound came from wind brushing across the tall prairie grass and a distant hawk circling above the pasture. Daniel finally walked with me to the concealed junction box I had photographed months earlier. We brushed aside the loose dirt together, exposing bright fittings that looked far newer than anything else nearby. He knelt beside the connection, studying each valve and coupling before taking several photographs of his own. Then he stood, wiped the dust from his hands, and quietly said something I will never forget. "Mr. Walker, this connection was never recorded with the county." Those 8 words changed everything. Nobody raised their voice after that. Nobody needed to. The oldest document on that ranch had finally met the newest pipe beneath the soil, and the truth was beginning to surface just as steadily as the groundwater waiting beneath my family's land. Daniel did not jump to conclusions, and that was exactly why I trusted what came next. He asked everyone to remain where they were while he contacted the county engineering office. The senior deputy agreed, and suddenly the entire driveway became strangely quiet. Linda paced across the gravel with her phone pressed against her ear, speaking in a low voice that grew more anxious with every passing minute. I leaned against the faded wooden fence outside the pump house, breathing in the familiar smell of sun-baked cedar and freshly turned earth. The same breeze that had cooled me through countless summers carried the faint scent of wild sage drifting up from the creek. It reminded me that land never rushed. It simply waited for people to catch up with the truth. About 40 minutes later, another county truck rolled through my front gate. This one belonged to the engineering department. A survey specialist stepped out carrying a bright orange equipment case and a tripod. Without saying much, he positioned a global positioning system receiver over one of the original survey markers my father had installed decades earlier. I smiled to myself because those old brass markers had survived floods, droughts, and generations of cattle. Linda had dismissed them as outdated little metal pins during one of our earlier conversations. Now they were becoming the most important objects on the entire ranch. The survey specialist slowly walked from marker to marker, while his handheld receiver displayed coordinates, matching the county database in real time. Every line confirmed exactly what my property survey had shown all along. The concealed pipeline crossed entirely onto private land before connecting to my well infrastructure. There was no recorded easement allowing that installation. There was no filed utility corridor. There was no legal right of access beyond the temporary permissions I had occasionally granted to contractors years earlier. Daniel compared the survey data with the county utility records one final time before closing his clipboard. His voice remained calm and professional. He explained that regardless of how long the connection had existed, public reliance alone could not create ownership rights over privately registered water infrastructure. Any permanent utility connection required documented approval, recorded easements, engineering review, and maintenance agreements. None of those records existed. Linda interrupted several times, insisting that everyone in the subdivision believed the water belonged to them because it had always been available. Daniel answered with remarkable patience. He explained that belief and documentation were not the same thing. Long-term use did not erase recorded ownership. Convenience did not replace legal filings. Assumptions did not become county records simply because enough people repeated them. The deputies listened carefully without taking sides. They were no longer responding to an emergency call. They were witnessing a property dispute supported by technical evidence instead of emotion. I reached into my truck once more and removed a small notebook my grandfather had carried for years. Inside were handwritten maintenance dates, pump pressure readings, replacement parts, and inspection notes stretching back decades. Oil stains covered several pages, and the edges had turned yellow with age, but every entry matched the official inspection reports stored in my folder. Daniel flipped through the notebook with genuine appreciation before handing it back. He smiled and quietly said that very few property owners kept records that complete anymore. Standing there beneath the wide Texas sky, surrounded by county officials, survey equipment, and the same ranch my family had cared for across 3 generations, I realized I had never been preparing for an argument. My grandfather had simply been preparing me for the day documentation would speak louder than anyone else's opinion. The atmosphere shifted so quietly that most people would have missed it. Nobody announced that the argument was over. Nobody admitted they had been wrong. Instead, the facts simply occupied the space where assumptions had been standing all morning. Daniel packed away the county maps with the same careful movements he had used when unfolding them, then explained that his office would file a formal report documenting the unauthorized utility connection and forward it to the appropriate county departments for review. The senior deputy thanked him, closed his notebook, and turned toward Linda with a calm expression that carried far more weight than raised voices ever could. He explained that there was no basis for any criminal action against me because I had performed maintenance on privately owned equipment located entirely on my own property. He also suggested that any remaining disagreement belonged in the civil process rather than on a 911 emergency line. Linda stood perfectly still for several seconds. The confidence she had carried into my driveway that morning slowly faded behind a forced smile that no longer convinced anyone. Around us, several Red Creek Estates residents had gathered near the entrance after hearing sirens echo across the valley. They whispered among themselves while looking from the deputies to the county engineers and finally toward the old pump house that had somehow become the center of their entire neighborhood. I recognized a few faces, families I had waved to over the years, children who had watched cattle graze from the subdivision trail. None of them looked angry. Most simply looked confused. They had trusted what they had been told without ever realizing there was another side of the story buried beneath the grass and limestone. Daniel spoke with several residents, patiently explaining that the issue was not about denying anyone water. It was about correcting an infrastructure problem that should have been addressed properly before homes were ever connected to a privately owned system. He even outlined the next steps the county would likely require, including engineering inspections, documented easements if both parties ever agreed to them, or construction of an independent municipal connection. Listening to him, I realized something important. The solution had never depended on winning an argument. It depended on finally following the process that should have existed from the beginning. Before leaving, the deputies returned the folder of documents to me. The senior deputy smiled and said he wished more property disputes arrived with complete records instead of angry accusations. I thanked him, shook his hand, and watched the patrol vehicles disappear down the gravel road as quietly as they had arrived. The county trucks followed a few minutes later, leaving only tire tracks that would disappear after the next rain. Linda lingered beside her vehicle, staring toward the silent pump house without saying a word. Eventually she climbed into her Lexus and drove back toward the subdivision. No dramatic exit, no final speech, just the soft crunch of gravel beneath expensive tires. As the dust settled, I looked across the pasture where the original brass survey markers still reflected tiny flashes of afternoon sunlight. The same markers some people had dismissed as outdated had guided every official back to the truth. My grandfather used to say that good fences did not create honest neighbors. Honest records did. Standing there beneath the endless Texas sky, breathing air that smelled of cedar, dry grass, and approaching evening, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Justice had not arrived with flashing lights or loud voices. It had arrived one document, one survey marker, and one verified fact at a time. The ranch was quiet again 3 weeks later. Morning sunlight spilled across the pasture exactly the way it had every day since I was a kid, painting the tall grass with streaks of gold while a gentle breeze carried the familiar smell of damp earth after an overnight shower. I stood beside the same steel valve where this entire ordeal had begun, running my hand across the weathered handle polished smooth by decades of honest work. The county had completed its preliminary review, and crews hired by Red Creek Estates had already begun disconnecting the unauthorized pipeline under county supervision. New engineering plans were being drafted so the subdivision could connect to the municipal water system that had always been intended to serve those homes. It would cost money. It would take time. But this time everything would be documented, inspected, and recorded the right way. Several homeowners stopped by my front gate over the following days. Not to argue, but to apologize. Many admitted they had genuinely believed the neighborhood owned the water because that was what they had always been told. I invited a few of them inside the old pump house and showed them the inspection tags, the maintenance logs, and the original registration plate that still carried the same identification number my grandfather had recorded decades earlier. Watching their expressions change reminded me that misinformation often grows where ordinary people never think to ask simple questions. One Saturday afternoon, I found a handwritten envelope tucked beneath the ranch gate. Inside was a short note from a family living near the back of the subdivision. They thanked me for remaining patient even after being accused of something I had not done. They also apologized for assuming the worst before hearing both sides. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my grandfather's old notebook alongside his maintenance records. Somehow it belonged there. The county survey markers still stood exactly where they always had, catching tiny flashes of sunlight every evening as cattle wandered peacefully through the pasture. Those little brass markers had never moved an inch. Only people's understanding of them had changed. Linda Brooks eventually stepped down as Homeowners Association president several months later, after the board elected new leadership, focused on rebuilding trust with residents and neighboring landowners. I never celebrated her departure because that was never the point. Titles come and go. Property records stay exactly where they are filed. One cool autumn morning, I finished replacing the pressure regulator inside the pump house. The air smelled of fresh cedar shavings from a fence repair I had completed the day before, and meadowlarks sang from the same oak trees where my father used to point out nesting birds when I was young. I reached for the old steel valve once again. This time, as I slowly turned the handle, the pump answered with its familiar steady hum. Water flowed smoothly through the lines serving my ranch, filling livestock troughs, irrigating pastures, and continuing the quiet routine my family had protected for generations. The sound felt almost identical to the one I remembered from the beginning of this story, but everything around it had changed. Back then, the silence after closing the valve had brought sirens. Now the steady rhythm of running water brought something far better. Peace. My grandfather used to tell me that water always finds the path it was meant to follow if you give it enough time. Standing there beneath the endless Texas sky, I realized justice works much the same way. It does not need to shout. It does not need to rush. It simply follows the truth until it reaches exactly where it belongs.